Before we get started, just want to give you a little bit of background of my backstory and how I got here today. So my first time in the US was actually in 2007. I was born and raised in Lebanon, came here to study, and decided to stay. So I first moved to New York, did a little bit of work in consulting, and very quickly wanted to go back to writing code, building software, and started a company in 2014 called Paribus, where we're focused on helping consumers save money. So at the peak of it, we were saving about 10 million customers, more than many $million a year on their online purchases. So whenever the price of something they had bought online dropped, we would automatically give them a refund on their purchases, working with the different stores. And 2 years later, we sold that company to Capital One, spent a bit of time in the card industry, and decided to leave Capital One after 2 years, and in 2019, started Ramp. So at Ramp, we're actually focused on helping businesses save money. And the way we do this is we help them understand their spend, control their spend, and reduce their spend in negotiations and all sorts of ways. So Ramp today is a $4 billion business. We raised about $600 million, have 170 employees, and are helping more than 2,000 businesses save money on their spend. So in the time that it took us to build and sell our first company, Paribus, we were able to achieve an outcome that was about 100 times the size in those same 2 years with Ramp. And the way we thought about it is, how do we make those bets? How do we look for bets that have very high magnitude in the case, a very high positive outcome in the case of success, as opposed to trying to minimize the risk? So, and I'm sure you've heard the stat before, but when you think about startups, generally, people will tell you most startups fail. 90% of companies don't make it. It's like a plane is crashing, and you're trying to rebuild that plane before gravity just pulls you down and crashes you. So you only have a limited amount of time to make a couple of bets. And you want to be focusing on the ones that have a potential to give you that escape velocity and really take off. And instead of asking people for advice and looking for sort of the average of all the advice you get out there, you should probably be taking bigger, bolder bets. Because if the average is failure, you don't want to be taking average advice. So the way we call this concept internally is just asymmetric outcomes, right? You want to look for outcomes where, in the case of success, you have a 10x payoff, and if you fail, maybe it's a 1x loss. So you don't want to limit your downside, but you want to maximize your upside. And we're going to be talking about what this asymmetric risk means in a little bit. So you can do that across different aspects of building and scaling a company, whether it's choosing your problem space, hiring your early employees, picking your vendors, partners, building product, and fundraising. So what is asymmetric? What is an asymmetric outcome? What are asymmetric risks? I don't know if any of you have played poker here, but if you have, I'm sure you've been in this situation where you've drawn a pretty bad hand, and people are going around the room, and everyone's betting, and then the size of the pot becomes big enough, and you're looking at your hand, you're like, well, my hand is not that great, but there's enough in the pot, I might as well try it. And this is exactly what it is. So sometimes you're not dealt a very good hand, but the prize at the end of it is good, so you might as well just give it a shot and try. Or another analogy here is, if you were playing a game where you're flipping a coin, in the case of heads, you win $1,000, but if you get tails, you lose $1,000. That's a pretty boring game. The outcomes are perfectly symmetrical. And if your goal was to play that game until you reached, say, $100,000, you would have to play that game at least 100 times, and that's if you're extremely lucky. Now, if the game was a little different, where you could flip heads and get $100,000, or flip tails and lose 10,000, that's a much better game to play. The outcomes are asymmetrical, but there's a catch. You need to be able to lose $10,000 to be able to play that second game. And that's how we thought about our problem space. So if you're trying to build a company that launches rockets into space, it's a lot harder to do that on $1 million of seed funding. But if you're able to raise more money, you're able to go after these bigger problems where the barriers to entry are high, but the outcomes are massive. And there's a lot of that in financial services. It's not random that most banks are more than 100 years old. Like Amex, who I would say is the incumbent in our space, is 161 years old at this point. In financial services, there are high barriers to entry. You need to be able to convince the banks to work with you. You need to be able to convince the card manufacturers to make cards for you. So the fact that we were second-time founders with Ramp allowed us to raise an outsized seed fund, and as a result, we decided to sort of go after a bigger space where it's harder to start. The same applies to hiring, right? The average advice on hiring generally goes something like this. Like, you have a checklist of competencies you're looking for, and you go competency by competency, trying to make sure that the person ticks all the boxes. The problem is most people who are exceptional at what they do tend to be very spiky. They don't have an evenly distributed skill set. And that first approach makes it very easy to find the flaws and to disqualify candidates, but it makes it very hard to find the people who have a 10x potential and can grow with you. So at Ramp, we were lucky to have had, I guess, interns in the years prior and worked with 2 freshmen, actually, at the time that we started working with them. One of them on the left, actually, Viral, had sold a company to Apple when he was a freshman at Stanford and was just exceptional at writing iOS code. He had 0 fintech experience. And the other one was Calvin, who was just extremely quick at building software. He also had 0 fintech experience and may not have had the communication skills of like an engineer who was more experienced. But those are the types of people that we chose to hire early on. Not because they had the experience and they were the low-risk bets, but because they had the slope that we were looking for. And when you hire these people, they scale with you, they scale with the company, and it makes it much easier to keep growing and grow your product. And sometimes we like to joke that we try to hire for a slope that matches our logo. But yeah, so that's been pretty good for us. The same applies to vendor, and I'm sure that's relevant to a lot of you today, right? The saying goes something like, no one ever got fired for choosing IBM. Or Jira, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Jira does everything well. If you want to limit your downside, like, no one's going to blame you if you choose Jira, because things are probably going to go right. The problem with making these like really obvious, safe choices is you miss out on potential opportunities of working with an up-and-coming vendor that can really alter the trajectory of your company if it works out. And when you're early stage, the cost of going with an up-and-coming vendor is really small. If things don't work out, the switching costs are usually easy. You have 2 or 3 accounts to replace. You only have a few issues to move over. So why not try it and make this bet? Shopify and Lyft bet on Stripe very early on. At the time, it was a very non-obvious choice. Stripe was a very small company, but they had something that they did very well, which is they made it very obvious and easy for developers to get started. At Ramp, we thought that one of our early competitive advantages was speed. So when we looked at issue tracking software that was available to us, we ended up going with the one that just offered that, and that was linear in our case. They didn't have all the features that Jira had, but they allowed us to move extremely quickly, and that advantage compounded over time. In some cases, if you pick the right vendors, you can have your cake and eat it too. So this is a cake that we had sent to us by our friends at SwagUp who are here in the room. And I guess the example here is like when you're working with like these scrappy earlier stage vendors, you're able to build relationships, help shape their product vision. It can match your product vision. You have skin in the game in each other's success. So it makes things a lot smoother and allows you to move a lot faster. Same with product, right? No one wants the faster horse. People wanted the car. And if you keep listening to the solutions that your customers give you, you're not going to end up with that 10x product that's going to alter the trajectory of your company. So there's a big difference between the remote on the left and the remote on the right. On the first one, maybe you just went and asked your customers, like, oh, which other button do you need? Or like, what's the next feature that you want? And you end up with something like the remote that looks like the one on the left. But if you make big, bold bets on product and listen to your customers' problems, not the solutions they're giving you, you're able to actually achieve big leaps and let your product actually help you win the market. And in some cases, there is asymmetric negative risk, right? There's asymmetric outcome on the negative side, and that tends to grow as your customer base grows. So you got to be careful for that and watch out. In our case at Ramp, we give people credit, right? We allow them to spend on our cards, and they pay us at the end of the month. And our business model is such that our revenue is about 1% of, or profits is about 1% of what we lend out. So for every mistake that we make, we need 100 customers to pay us back. So this is an area where we've decided to not take any risk, because the cost of making a mistake is 100 times bigger than the reward if we get it right. And this applies in a lot of companies. Like you can think about the risks that you would take where it could like really drop your customer satisfaction score, and these are the areas that you want to avoid. So try to figure out the areas where you can take a lot of risks and make these big, bold bets, and isolate them from the ones where you shouldn't be. Choosing your investors. That's another big one. A lot of startups, I'm sure, are out there like trying to meet investors and fundraise, and it's easy to get drawn by like the headlines of like big prices, large rounds, and think that price is really everything. But when in reality, the price is almost never like a good indicator of like how well the fundraising went. There's a lot that goes into fundraising, and the terms that you raise at are extremely important, particularly when you're raising your first institutional round. And if you're able to attract a reputable investor, generally what reputable investors come with is really clean terms. You avoid things like liquidation preferences or weird covenants or giving up too many board seats early on. And as a result, if you're able to raise from a reputable investors on very clean terms early on, it makes every other fundraising conversation much easier down the line. So you don't want to optimize for that first fundraise, but every time you fundraise, you want to be thinking about all the other rounds that you're going to have to do after that, especially if you're trying to go after a big outcome. And the other thing that's interesting with that is if you're able to attract a really reputable investor, even if it's not at the highest price, and you're a B2B company, you can call up your potential customers. You can call up angel investors. Like today, a lot of founders are angel investors, and they get asymmetric upside from investing alongside these reputable investors because they don't have to pay the 2% and 20% that the VCs charge. So right, these investors are able to invest alongside the founders funds, the Sequoias, the Andreessen, and not pay 2 and 20. So it's a pretty obvious decision for them to make. And as a result, you end up having a lot of your customers on your cap table. You can call them up for advice, and they'll be your first beta customers. And yeah, that's all I got for you today. So in summary, bigger bets don't have to be scarier. They tend to be less risky, actually, especially if you look for opportunities to have an asymmetric outcome in the case of success. And these are the areas where you should be thinking about risk differently than, I guess, the average advice you find on the internet. So thank you.